The chamber was built to make you feel small. That was the whole point of it, really. The Galactic Council Hall on Vareth Prime had been constructed 400 years ago by the Hani architects, who had a very specific philosophy when it came to buildings. If you want beings to behave themselves, make them feel like insects first. The ceiling stretched up nearly 300 meters, all black polished stone and sweeping arches that glowed faintly blue at the edges. The seats for the observer delegations were tiny, almost deliberately uncomfortable, arranged in tiered rows that wrapped around the central floor like a coliseum. And down on that central floor, where the actual speaking happened, the acoustics were designed so that every word you said came back to you slightly delayed, slightly warped, as if the room itself was whispering that you were wrong before you even finished your sentence. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had been walking into this room for 6 years, and she still had to remind herself to breathe when she crossed the threshold. She was 43 years old. Short hair, dark eyes, the kind of face that people described as serious when they meant intimidating. She had grown up in Guadalajara, studied political science at UNAM, then spent 12 years doing conflict mediation work in some of the ugliest places Earth had to offer before the United Nations tapped her for the Galactic Relations Program. She spoke 6 Earth languages fluently and had working knowledge of 4 alien ones. She could read Hani body language well enough to know when she was being lied to, which in the council happened roughly every 17 minutes on average. Today she sat in the 3rd row of the human delegation box and watched the session begin, and she already knew it was going to be bad. The issue on the floor was the Veth. If you didn't know about the Veth, here is what you needed to understand. They were a small species. Not metaphorically. Physically small, standing maybe a meter tall at full adult height, with pale gray skin and large eyes that caught light in a way that made them look perpetually frightened. They lived on 4 planets in a cluster near the edge of the Orion Arm, planets that happened to sit directly in the path of a major trade corridor used by 6 of the 12 council member species. For 200 years, the Veth had been living more or less peacefully on those worlds, farming, building cities, developing their own slow and careful civilization. Then the Kareth had found lithium deposits on one of the Veth moons. The Kareth were, to put it plainly, the most powerful species in the council. They were large, physically imposing, with a military that nobody had directly challenged in living memory. They had a seat on the council's permanent board, which meant they had veto power over resolutions, which meant that when they wanted something, they generally got it. They had spent the last 18 months making legal arguments for why the Veth moon technically fell under unclaimed resource territory, despite the fact that the Veth had been using it as a sacred astronomical site for roughly 6 generations. Elena had read the brief 3 times on the transport over. The legal arguments were not good. They were, frankly, embarrassing. But nobody on the council was going to say that, because nobody on the council wanted to be on the wrong side of the Kareth. The session opened with the usual formalities. Council Speaker Drathenma, a Hani elder with silver scales and the practiced boredom of someone who had been running meetings for 40 years, called the chamber to order. The translation feeds activated, each delegation's earpieces feeding them real-time language conversion in whatever tongue they preferred. Elena kept hers on English by default but could flip to the raw Galactic standard when she needed to catch subtext. The Kareth representative was named Vorexol. He was big even by Kareth standards, with a wide flat face and layered neck plates that indicated high social standing in their culture. He stood at the central podium looking like he already knew how this was going to end, which he probably did. "The matter before the council," he began, his voice carrying the particular deep resonance of Kareth formal speech, "is straightforward. The 3rd satellite of Veth 4 contains mineral resources of significant value to galactic trade and industry. The current designation of this satellite as a restricted cultural zone is based on outdated classification procedures that predate the modern resource mapping protocols. We are requesting a reclassification." Elena watched the other delegations. The Torati, who did a lot of shipping business with the Kareth, were already nodding slightly. The Sonari delegation sat perfectly still, which with Sonari was how you knew they agreed. The Brel were looking at their documents and pretending to study them, which meant they had already decided to abstain. This was how it went. This was how it always went. She felt something shift in her chest. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger. Something she had felt the first time she watched a negotiation fail because one side had more money than the other and everyone in the room decided to call that reality. The Veth representative was a small female named Taitsa. She had been given exactly 12 minutes to respond, which was the standard allocation for non-permanent board species. She stood at the secondary podium looking like she was holding herself together through pure will, and she gave her 12 minutes everything she had. The moon was not just a cultural site. It was a navigational anchor that the Veth had used for 1,000 years to track astronomical events that governed their agricultural calendar. It was where they buried their honored dead, whose remains they believed communicated with the stars. It was the subject of their oldest literature, their oldest music, their oldest prayers. Mining it would not just take a resource. It would take something that could not be replaced or relocated or compensated for in any currency the Kareth were offering. She spoke beautifully. Elena thought it was one of the better speeches she had heard in this chamber. When the 12 minutes were up, the speaker cut her off mid-sentence and moved to discussion. The next 2 hours were the kind of thing that made Elena understand why people burned buildings down. Speaker after speaker from the major delegations offered carefully worded non-commitments. We recognize the cultural concerns. We believe a balanced approach can be found. Further study of the resource impact may be warranted. Nobody said anything that meant anything. Nobody was going to go on record opposing the Kareth unless they had to. The human delegation had 15 minutes of floor time, scheduled near the end of the discussion block. Elena's briefing from the Department of Galactic Affairs had been clear. Express measured concern, support further dialogue, do not antagonize the Kareth, do not take a hard position. Humanity was still relatively new to the Council. We had been members for only 30 years. We had trade relationships to protect, security agreements that were still being negotiated, political capital that needed to be spent carefully. Elena had read the briefing. She had understood the reasoning behind it. She had even agreed with it once, a long time ago. Her deputy, a young man named Kwame Asante who was 28 years old and very good at his job, leaned over and murmured, "We're up in about 20 minutes. You want me to pull up the prepared statement?" "No," Elena said. Kwame looked at her. He had been her deputy for 2 years. He knew that tone. "Ambassador," he said carefully, "the prepared statement was approved by the department." "I know. It specifically says we should avoid." "I know what it says, Kwame." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a lower voice, "What are you going to do?" Elena watched Taitsa, who had returned to the Veth delegation's small box in the upper tiers and was sitting very still. From this distance it was hard to read her face, but Elena had learned to read Veth body language over the past year and a half of following this case. The way Taitsa was holding her hands in her lap, fingers pressed together, was what Veth did when they were trying very hard not to show that they were afraid. "I'm going to say what I think," Elena said. Kwame exhaled slowly. "The department is not going to be happy." "Probably not. The Kareth have a seat on the Trade Negotiation Committee and we have 3 bilateral agreements currently under review with them." "I know. This could set us back years." "Yes," Elena said. "It could." Kwame looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back in his seat and said nothing else. He was young, but he was smart, and somewhere under the professional caution there was something that had brought him to this work in the first place, some reason he had chosen galactic diplomacy over the dozens of other careers available to someone with his abilities. Elena had seen it in him from the first week. You didn't last in this work otherwise. When the floor time notification came up for the human delegation, Elena stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked down to the central floor. The hall was very large and very quiet as she crossed to the main podium. Not the secondary one, where the Veth had been placed. The main one, which was technically reserved for permanent board members and their guests, but which nobody had ever actually codified into the rules because the Hani architects had assumed everyone would simply know their place. Elena did not know her place, or rather, she had decided not to accept the one she had been given. There was a small murmur from the upper tiers. She saw Voraxol watching her from the Kareth box with the expression that powerful species got when they encountered something unexpected, A kind of flat attention that was not quite curiosity and not quite irritation. Not yet. She adjusted the translation interface on the podium. Set it to broadcast in Galactic Standard with simultaneous conversion to all 17 languages of the current council membership. Checked that her voice feed was active. Took one breath. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said. "I represent humanity on this council. I've been doing this job for 6 years, and in that time I have sat in this chamber and watched approximately 47 decisions get made, and I want to tell you something honestly, I have been wrong about this place." That got people's attention. The murmur grew slightly, then settled into a very focused silence. I came here believing that the Galactic Council was what it said it was. A body for collective governance. A forum where the rule of law meant something, where the rights of every species were considered, where the strong and the weak had equal standing because that was the whole point. I believed that because I read the founding documents and they were very clear about it. I spent 6 years watching this council work and I kept telling myself I was seeing something that wasn't there, that the system was more fair than it looked, that I just didn't understand the nuances yet. She paused. I understand the nuances now. And what I understand is this. The Galactic Council, as currently practiced, is not a governance body. It is a management structure for the interests of its most powerful members, dressed up in the language of collective law so that the less powerful members feel included enough to keep participating. And the vote you are about to take on the Veth Moon is the clearest example of that I have seen in 6 years. The silence in the chamber had gone from focused to something harder to name. Elena could see the Kareth delegation box from her position. Vorksoul had gone very still. "Let me be specific," she continued. "The legal arguments for reclassifying that moon are not serious arguments. I want to say that plainly in this chamber for the record. Any first-year law student on any of our worlds could identify the 3 fundamental errors in the jurisdictional claim the Kareth have submitted. The resource mapping protocols cited were adopted in the 2nd century of the Council's existence specifically to prevent what is being proposed here. There is no legitimate legal basis for this reclassification. There is only power. There is only the fact that one species wants something and has enough weight in this room that everyone else has decided not to notice the difference." Vorksoul rose slightly from his seat. Council protocol required that he wait to be recognized before speaking, and he clearly did not like that constraint right now. Elena watched him settle back, just barely. The Veth have used that moon for 1,000 years. They have dead buried in it. They have mathematics built around it. They have stories about it that go back before the Kareth knew they existed. And the argument being made is that this does not constitute a claim serious enough to override an economic interest. That is not law. That is not governance. That is just might making right and calling itself procedure. She looked up at the Veth delegation box. Taithsa was watching her with an expression Elena couldn't fully read, something between hope and the careful suppression of hope that comes from having been disappointed before. "I am going to tell you something about humans," Elena said, and her voice changed slightly, became something that people who knew her recognized as the thing underneath the diplomacy. "We have a very long history on our planet. Long and very bloody and full of exactly the kind of thing that is happening in this room right now. Species more powerful than other species deciding that the less powerful did not really own what they owned, did not really have standing for the rights they claimed, did not really matter as much as the resources they happened to be sitting on." She paused. "We did that to each other for thousands of years. We called it by different names at different times. We had very sophisticated legal and philosophical frameworks for why it was acceptable. And then, slowly, painfully, generation by generation, we started to figure out that it wasn't. That what made a civilization actually worth the name was not whether it could protect its powerful members, which is easy, but whether it could protect its weakest ones, which is the whole test. The whole actual test of whether you have built something real." The chamber was very, very quiet. "I was told to come here today and express measured concern. I was told not to antagonize our trading partners. I was told that humanity's position in this council is still developing and we need to spend our political capital carefully. All of that is true. All of that is reasonable advice." She looked around the chamber. All 17 delegations. The old powerful ones, the newer ones, the ones that had everything and the ones that were just trying to hold on. But I have sat in this room for 6 years and I have watched measured concern accomplish nothing 47 times. So today I am going to be impolite. She did not stop there. This was the part that people would remember afterward, the part that got transmitted back to every council member world and replayed in political commentary feeds for the next 6 months. Because Elena Vasquez did not give the polished 10-minute statement that a trained diplomat was supposed to give. She stood at that podium for 41 minutes. Nobody stopped her. This was partly because of council protocol, which had a mechanism for cutting off speakers but required a 2/3 vote to invoke it, and getting 2/3 of this particular chamber to agree on anything in real time was practically impossible. It was partly because Voraxol, who had the Kareth weight to force the issue, seemed to calculate that interrupting her would look worse than letting her finish. And it was partly, Elena would later admit to Kwame, because she was saying things that some of the people in that room had been thinking for a long time. She went through the legal history. Not in the dry way that lawyers went through legal history, but in the way that a person who had spent years watching law fail people went through it, with specific cases and specific moments and specific names. She talked about the Farathi displacement, 60 years ago, where a species had been relocated from their home system on the basis of a mining survey that later turned out to have been falsified, and the council had spent 20 years debating whether to acknowledge what had happened. She talked about the Chiron trade agreements of the Third Council era, which had locked 4 small species into economic arrangements so one-sided that 2 of them had not recovered in 150 years. She talked about the Neth, who no longer had a delegation because there were no longer enough Neth to send one. She was not shouting. That was the thing people noticed most when they watched the recording later. She never raised her voice. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are not performing anger but carrying it, when it has been with them long enough that it has become quiet and very heavy and very precise. This council has a founding document, she said. Most of you know it. All of your governments ratified it. It says in the opening paragraph that the purpose of this body is to ensure that the development of galactic civilization proceeds in a manner that protects the rights and dignity of all species, regardless of their military or economic standing. Not the most powerful species. All species. It says that explicitly. It uses the word all. She looked at the speaker's platform. Speaker Drathenma, I would like the founding document read into the record for this session. There was a pause. The speaker, who had been in his position for 18 years and had heard a great many things in this chamber, looked at her with an expression that was hard to interpret. That is an unusual request, he said. It is in the procedural handbook, Elena said. Article 7, Section 3. Any delegating member may request the founding document be entered into the session record. It has been done 11 times in council history. Another pause. Then, the founding document will be entered into the record. Elena nodded. Thank you. She turned back to the chamber. I want to be clear about what I am saying today and what I am not saying. I am not threatening anyone. I am not making demands on behalf of humanity that go beyond our standing in this body. What I am doing is using my 15 minutes of floor time. She glanced at the clock display, which showed she had already gone well past 15 minutes and that nobody had moved to stop her, to say, clearly and on the record, what the human delegation believes. She straightened slightly. We believe the reclassification request for the Veth Moon should be rejected on legal grounds. We believe the existing cultural designation is valid and should be upheld. We will be voting against the reclassification. And we want every species in this chamber to know that this is not a temporary position or a bargaining chip. It is a commitment. She let that land. Humanity has been in this council for 30 years. We know we are new here. We know we do not have the history or the relationships or the accumulated weight of the older members. We have been told many times to be patient, to learn how things work, to earn standing before we try to change anything. We have tried to do that. We have been patient. Her voice was still level, still quiet. But I need to tell you something that I think is important for this council to understand about humans, because I think there may be a misunderstanding about what kind of species we are. We have a saying on Earth, we stand for the weak. It is not a political slogan. It is not a diplomatic position. It is something very old, something that comes from a very long and very painful history of watching what happens when nobody does. We learned it the hard way over thousands of years, and we are not going to unlearn it because it is inconvenient here. She paused. If this council votes to strip the Veth of their moon today, the human delegation will formally request a review of the vote under the founding documents protection clause. We will submit a full legal brief challenging the reclassification. We will make that brief public to every member world. We will request that this issue be raised at the next council plenary. And we will do all of that not because we think it will necessarily work, but because it is what the founding document requires of us, and because doing nothing when a wrong is being done is a choice, and we have decided not to make that choice. She stepped back from the podium slightly. One more thing. I want to say this to the Kareth delegation specifically, and I want to say it with respect, because I do not believe in being disrespectful to anyone in this room. Voraxol was watching her. His face was unreadable. You are powerful. We know that. Everyone in this room knows that. You have built something genuinely remarkable and your species has a history that commands real respect. But I want you to understand something from one species to another. The moon you want is worth less than what you will lose if you take it this way. Not economically. Not militarily. In something harder to measure and harder to recover. She thought about how to say it and then decided to just say it plainly. There are species in this room right now that have been watching. Not just today. For years. They are watching to see what this council actually is, what it actually protects, whether the founding document means anything when it costs something to uphold it. Some of those species are small and some of them are not. Some of them are in positions right now where they need to decide whether to trust this body or to start making other plans. How you vote today is going to tell them something. I want you to think about what you want to tell them. She looked around the chamber one last time. Thank you for your time. She walked back to the human delegation box. The chamber was completely silent for 4 full seconds, which in a room full of beings from 17 different species with 17 different notions of silence, was extraordinary. Then it erupted. Kwame was waiting for her when she sat down. He had his professional face on, the one that did not give anything away, but his hands were gripping his data tablet in a way that suggested a great deal was being given away internally. Well, he said. I know, Elena said. The department is going to call. Yes. Probably before we get back to the ship. Almost certainly. He was quiet for a moment, watching the chamber floor where several delegations were now clustered in rapid side conversations, with the kind of body language that in any species indicated people urgently recalculating something. For what it's worth, Kwame said finally, I think Taithsa is crying. Elena looked up at the Veth delegation box. Taithsa was indeed doing something with her face that in humans would have been crying. With Veth it was slightly different, a trembling of the secondary eyelids, but the function was the same. Yeah, Elena said softly. Her communication device lit up. The Department of Galactic Affairs. She looked at it for a moment, then put it face down on her knee. I'll call them back in an hour, she said. Right? Kwame said. Down on the chamber floor, Speaker Drathenma was calling for order. The vote had not yet been held. The discussion period had technically not closed. Several delegations were requesting additional floor time, which under the rules they were entitled to. Elena settled into her seat and watched. She did not know how the vote was going to go. She genuinely did not know. What she knew was that she had said what needed to be said, in the room where it needed to be said, and that whatever happened next, it was going to happen on the record, with every word of today in the official transcript, which was distributed to every member world within 24 hours of each session. The Galactic Council Hall was built to make you feel small. Elena Vasquez did not feel small. The vote did not happen that day. This was not a victory exactly, but it was not nothing. After Elena finished speaking and the chamber descended into the kind of organized chaos that council sessions sometimes produced, 3 separate delegations requested formal recesses for consultation. The Brel, who had been planning to abstain, suddenly needed to review their legal position. The Torati, who had been leaning toward supporting the Kareth, requested a 72-hour delay to allow for thorough deliberation of the legal concerns raised. Even the Sonari, who had not made a sound in 4 hours of discussion, sent a formal written query to the Speaker's office asking about the founding document protection clause that Elena had mentioned. The vote was postponed for 6 days pending further consultation. Elena spent the first hour of those 6 days on the comm with the Department of Galactic Affairs, which went about as well as she had expected. Deputy Director Hiruto Nakamura, who was a good man and had been doing his job for 22 years, spent most of the call in a controlled version of a panic. "You understand what you've done," he said. "Not a question. I said what needed to be said. You accused the Kareth of bad faith in an open session. You publicly challenged the Council's procedural legitimacy. You committed the human delegation to a legal challenge that we don't have the staff to actually execute in the timeframe you implied. Then we'd better hire more staff." A pause on the line. "Elena. Hiruto, tell me something. In the 22 years you've been doing this job, how many times has measured concern changed an outcome?" Another pause. "Longer this time." "That's not the point," he said. "We have relationships to maintain." "We have." "Hiruto, how many times?" The silence on the line had a particular quality to it. Elena knew Nakamura well enough to know what it meant. He was a man who had come into this work for a reason and had spent 2 decades learning to live with the gap between the reason and the reality. "I'm not going to pretend this wasn't the right thing to say," he told her finally. "I'm going to tell you it was extremely reckless and could have significant consequences for our standing in the Council, and I'm going to mean that. And then I'm going to tell you that we will deal with whatever comes, and I'll have a legal team assigned to the Protection Clause brief by end of week." Elena felt something unclench slightly in her chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. The Kareth ambassador to Earth has already requested an emergency meeting with our foreign minister." "I know. It's going to be a difficult conversation." "I know that too. Get some sleep," Nakamura said, and ended the call. She didn't sleep much. She spent the first night in her quarters on the human diplomatic ship reviewing Council records, specifically every instance in the body's history where the protection clause had been invoked, what had happened, and what it had ultimately produced. The record was not encouraging. Of the 11 previous invocations, 3 had resulted in substantive policy changes, 5 had produced extended deliberation periods that eventually collapsed without resolution, and 3 had been quietly set aside without any formal outcome at all. But she had not been bluffing. That was the thing she needed the Council to understand, and the thing she needed to make real in the next 6 days. She sent a message to her counterpart in the Torati delegation, a career diplomat named Soreth who she had cultivated carefully over 3 years of patient, boring, grinding relationship work. She did not ask for anything in the message. She just laid out the legal argument clearly, in Galactic standard with a Torathi-specific cultural framing that she had spent months learning to do properly, and she asked if Soreth would be willing to have a conversation. Soreth responded within 2 hours. She sent a similar message to the Brel second delegate, with whom she had worked on a minor trade arbitration 2 years ago. Also yes, though with considerably more hedging language. She sent a message to the Keth delegation, a smaller species that rarely spoke in open session but had been one of the founding members of the Council 4 centuries ago. The Keth were old and methodical and intensely legalistic. They cared about precedent the way humans cared about breathing. If the founding document protection clause meant anything to anyone in that chamber, it was the Keth. The Keth response came 6 hours later. It was 4 sentences long. It said that the Keth delegation would review the matter carefully and would appreciate receiving a copy of the legal brief when it was complete. Elena put her head down on her desk for a moment. Then she called Kwame in and they started drafting the brief. The next 6 days were the kind of work that never made it into the stories people told about diplomacy afterward. No more dramatic speeches. No chamber moments. Just long nights and a lot of documents and a steady stream of quiet conversations in corridors and small meeting rooms and via encrypted comm channels. Kwame turned out to be, among his other qualities, an exceptional legal drafter. He had a training in international law that Elena had known about but never really seen deployed at full capacity before. He built the protection clause argument from the ground up, every citation precise, every precedent carefully distinguished, the logical structure clean and hard to attack. Elena contributed the political framing, the parts that translated the legal argument into something that species with different legal traditions and different histories could receive. On the third day, something unexpected happened. Taithsa requested a meeting. Elena said yes immediately. They met in a small conference room that the council building provided for delegation consultations, a neutral space with no recording except the standard security monitoring. Taithsa came alone, which was unusual. Most senior delegates brought staff. The Veth representative sat across from Elena and was quiet for a moment. In Veth culture, silence at the start of an important conversation was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement that what was about to be said mattered. Elena waited. "I want to understand," Taithsa said finally, in her careful Galactic standard. "Why did you do this?" Elena looked at her. "You know why. I want to hear you say it. Because it was wrong. What they're doing is wrong and everybody in that room knows it and nobody was going to say so." Taithsa was quiet again for a moment. "You understand that this may not work. Even with your legal argument. Even with the support you're building. The Kareth have enough weight that they can still push this through." "I know. And you did it anyway." "Yes. In my culture," Taithsa said slowly, "there is a concept. I'm not sure how it translates. The closest thing in Galactic Standard is probably something like chosen debt. It is when someone takes on a burden that was not theirs to carry. When someone sees a weight that belongs to another and picks it up without being asked." Elena said nothing. "My people have watched this proceeding for 18 months, Taithsa continued. "We have engaged every channel available to us. We have made our legal case 17 different ways. We have spoken with every delegation that would meet with us. We have been told, very politely and very consistently, that there is nothing to be done." She looked at Elena with those large eyes that caught light in a way that made them look perpetually frightened, and Elena realized she had been misreading that quality all along. It was not fear. It was attention. The Veth looked at everything with complete and total attention. And then a human stood at the main podium, Taithsa said, and said what was true. Elena felt something tighten in her throat that she was not going to address in this meeting. "It might not change anything," she said again. "It already has," Taithsa said. "You do not see it from where you are. But I have been in communication with 7 delegations in the past 3 days who have asked to speak with the Veth Cultural Preservation Committee. 3 of them have never spoken to us before. Not once in 18 months. One of them is the Keth." Elena took a slow breath. "Whatever happens with the vote," Taithsa said, "my people will remember this. We do not have many resources to offer you. We are a small species and we know it. But we remember." "I didn't do it for anything in return," Elena said. "I know that," Taithsa said simply. "That is why we will remember it." On the 5th day, the Kareth made a move that Elena had not anticipated. Voraxol requested a private meeting with the human delegation. Elena agreed, with Kwame present and the standard diplomatic record protocols active. Voraxol was different in a private setting than he was at the council podium. Still large, still carrying that particular physical authority that the Kareth seemed to produce naturally, but also more direct. Less performative. Elena respected that. He came in without staff, sat down across from her, and looked at her for a long moment with the flat, assessing attention of his species. "I want to understand what you want," he said. "I want the vote to fail," Elena said. "I want the Veth to keep their moon." "That is not going to happen," Voraxol said. "Not aggressively. Matter-of-factly. We have the votes. We may have had a slight delay in confirming them, but we will have them by the time the session reconvenes." Elena looked at him steadily. "Are you sure?" A slight pause. "Relatively. Then why are you here?" Voraxol was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone choosing between several versions of what they wanted to say. "In my culture," he said finally, "there is value in understanding a new variable. You are a new variable. I'm a diplomat. You are something I have not encountered before in this chamber," he said. "I have been on the council for 9 years. I have seen many species make moral arguments. They are usually political instruments. They last for one session and then the species goes back to its actual interests. I am trying to determine whether you are doing the same thing. Elena considered this. It was a fair question. I'm not going to pretend humanity has no interests, she said. We do. We have trade relationships and security concerns and political needs just like everyone else. What I'm telling you is that this is also a real thing, not a performance. Humans have a problem with watching the strong take from the weak and calling it procedure. We have tried very hard over the course of our history to build systems that prevent it. It does not always work, but we take it seriously when it fails. Voraxol studied her. Even when it costs you something, he said. Even then. He was quiet for a moment. You understand, he said, that if we reverse our position now, it creates significant domestic problems for us. Our government has committed to this resource claim publicly. The political cost of withdrawal would be substantial. Elena heard the shape of what he was saying and felt something clarify inside her. There are ways to withdraw from a position that don't look like defeat, she said carefully. Joint cultural preservation agreements. Long-term resource sharing frameworks with VETH consent. Ways to acknowledge that further review revealed complications that changed the calculus. Voraxol looked at her for a long moment. You have been thinking about this, he said. For about 3 days. Why? Because I don't want to fight, Elena said. I want the VETH to keep their moon. If you can give them that without it being a fight, that's better for everyone. He was quiet for a longer time. I will need to consult with my government, he said. Of course. He stood. Looked down at her with that flat, assessing gaze. You are a strange species, he said. Not unkindly. We've been told that before, Elena said. The vote, when it finally happened, was not what anyone had predicted. The Kareth withdrew their reclassification request. Not a defeat. Not a withdrawal under pressure, at least not in any language the official statement used. The official statement cited, new technical data suggesting additional environmental impact review is warranted, and announced that the Kareth government would be entering into a joint preservation dialogue with the VETH Cultural Ministry. The statement was carefully written and gave everyone a way to call it something other than a reversal. 3 people in that chamber knew exactly what it was. The reaction from the other delegations was a kind of muted astonishment. The Torati second delegate caught Elena's eye as she returned to her seat and gave her the Torati formal acknowledgement gesture, which roughly translated as, I have seen something worth noting. The Brel delegation clustered together in what looked like an urgent hushed conversation. The Keth delegation sat perfectly still and said nothing, which was how the Keth looked when they were extremely interested in something. Taithsa, in the VETH box, had her eyes closed. Kwame leaned over to Elena. The department is going to call again. I know. Nakamura sounded genuinely surprised when I briefed him this morning. I think he actually said, huh, at one point. Good huh or bad huh? I think just huh. Elena looked at the chamber. At the 150 delegates from 17 species. At the soaring black stone walls and the faintly glowing blue arches and the ceiling that stretched so far up it was almost sky. Can I ask you something? Kwame said, yeah. When you walked up to that podium 6 days ago, did you know this was going to work? Elena thought about it honestly. No, she said. I thought it probably wasn't going to work. I thought we were most likely going to lose the vote and the Kareth were going to get their moon and I was going to get recalled and have a very unpleasant year. So why? She looked at him. He was 28 years old. He had come to this work for a reason. Because the VETH representative had 12 minutes, Elena said. She had 12 minutes to argue for something her people had carried for 1,000 years, and they cut her off in the middle of a sentence. And everyone in that room was going to let that stand. And I decided I didn't want to be one of the people who let it stand. Kwame was quiet. That's going to make a good story someday, he said. Maybe, Elena said. Or maybe it's just what you're supposed to do and we've all been telling ourselves it's unusual for so long that it started to feel that way. But the story did not end there, because the things that actually matter never end where you think they will. In the weeks that followed the Kareth withdrawal, something started happening in the council that was subtle and slow and almost impossible to point to directly. A Sonari delegation that had been silent on a Farathi territorial dispute for 8 months asked to be included in the mediation. The Brel submitted a formal review request on an old trade agreement that 3 smaller species had been contesting for years. 2 species that had never spoken publicly in open session at all began participating in procedural discussions. None of it was dramatic. None of it made the kind of headlines that a 41-minute speech at the main podium made. But Elena watched it and felt something she had not felt much in 6 years of sitting in this chamber. She felt like the room was changing. Not fixed. Not by any means fixed. The same power structures existed, the same imbalances, the same tendency for the heaviest species to set the terms of every conversation. All of that was still there and would be there for a long time. But something had shifted slightly in the distribution of what people in this room were willing to say out loud. She received a communication from the Keth senior delegate, which was notable because the Keth almost never communicated outside of formal channels. The message said that the Keth delegation had reviewed the history of Protection Clause invocations and had prepared a set of proposed clarifications to the relevant council procedural articles that would strengthen the mechanism. They were asking whether the human delegation would be willing to co-sponsor the proposal. Elena sent back yes within 5 minutes. She received a message from a species called the Alith, who she had never heard of before, because the Alith were not a council member species. They were an observer species, too small and too new to galactic contact to have formal standing yet. The message was careful and formal and slightly awkward in its galactic standard, clearly written by someone still learning the language, and it said that the Alith Governing Assembly had been following council proceedings and had seen the session recording and wanted to know if the human delegation would be willing to meet with their outreach representative. Elena looked at that message for a long time. Then she wrote back, "Yes, absolutely, we would love to meet. Here are times that work for us. Please bring whatever documentation you want to share. We will bring coffee, which is a human beverage that we find helpful for long conversations if you are able to consume it, and if not, we will bring whatever you prefer." Kwame, reading over her shoulder, "You added the part about coffee. I always add the part about coffee. The Alith outreach representative might not know what coffee is." "Then we'll explain it," Elena said. "That's how you start." 3 months after the session, Elena was asked to give a talk at the Galactic Council's annual diplomatic training program, a yearly event where new delegates from member species spent a week learning council procedures and history. She was not the most obvious choice for such an event, given that she had recently spent 41 minutes going off script at the main podium, but the invitation came from the speaker's office directly, which she found interesting. She spent a week thinking about what to say. On the day of the talk, she stood in front of about 60 young delegates, none of them older than equivalent mid-20s in their species age ranges, all of them new to this place and carrying the particular mix of idealism and anxiety that new diplomats always carried. She did not talk about strategy. She did not talk about political capital or bilateral relationships or how to read Hani body language. The training program covered all of that. She talked about something different. "You are going to spend a lot of time in this work," she told them, "being told what is realistic, what is possible, what you have to accept because the alternative is worse. Some of that advice will be correct and you should listen to it carefully. But some of it will be something else. Some of it will be other people's accommodation to a situation, mistaken for permanent truth." She looked at the faces in the room. Different shapes, different colors, different ways of expressing attention. All of them watching her. There is a thing that happens to people who spend a long time in places like this council. The gap between what a place says it is and what it actually does becomes invisible to them. They stop seeing it. It gets folded into the background of how things work and they navigate around it without noticing. That is a very efficient adaptation. It is also very dangerous. She paused. "The most important skill I can tell you to develop is the ability to keep seeing that gap. To look at what a document says and then look at what is actually happening and hold both of those things in your vision at the same time, clearly, without flinching. Because the moment you stop seeing the gap is the moment you stop being able to do anything about it." A young Torati delegate in the front row, who had large bright eyes and the eager posture of someone who had studied for years to be in this room, raised a hand. "What do you do when you see it and you can't fix it?" Elena thought about 47 decisions. About Tathsaw's 12 minutes getting cut off mid-sentence. About the Neth, who no longer had a delegation because there were no longer enough Neth to send one. You say so, she said. You say what you see, clearly, on the record, in the room where it matters. Not because it will definitely work. Sometimes it will not work. But because the record matters. Because the other species in the room who are also watching need to see that someone is willing to say it. Because the silence of people who know better is the most useful thing that the powerful have, and the simplest way to take it away from them is to not be silent. The Torah-T delegate wrote something down. And then you keep working, Elena said. You write the brief. You make the calls. You have the boring meetings in small rooms with people who are maybe, starting to reconsider something. You do the work that doesn't get recorded and doesn't get praised and takes years to show results. That is most of the job. She thought of Kwame, who at this moment was probably in a small meeting room somewhere in this building having exactly that kind of meeting on behalf of the Aleph outreach proposal, which they had been carefully shepherding toward formal consideration for 8 weeks. You are going to be told that the way things are is the way things have to be, she said. You are going to hear that 100 times in this building, from very experienced and intelligent people, and it will sound reasonable because they will have excellent reasons for it. I want you to be respectful of those people. I want you to listen carefully to what they tell you. And I want you to remember that every system that has ever been changed was first described as unchangeable. She looked around the room. We are all, every species in this building, newer to the galaxy than we think we are. We are all still figuring out how to do this. We do not have to accept that the mistakes of the first 400 years are permanent features of how this council works. The founding document says what it says. It means what it says. The question is whether we are willing to mean it too. She stepped back. That is all I wanted to say. Thank you for listening. On the transport back to Earth 2 weeks later, Elena sat in her cabin and looked out the small porthole at the stars. She had been in this work for 6 years. She would probably be in it for a long time more. There were going to be more sessions like the one before the Kareth withdrew, more rooms full of silence and careful language and the accumulated weight of power deciding what was real. There were going to be more species with 12-minute floor allocations and 1,000 years of something that mattered. She was going to keep sitting in those rooms. She was going to keep watching for the gap between what was said and what was done. And when the moment came where someone needed to stand at the main podium and say what was true, she was going to do that. Not because she was brave. She did not particularly think of herself as brave. Not because she knew it was going to work. She had already been clear with herself about how often it would not work. Because the Veth had buried their dead in that moon for 6 generations. Because somewhere in the founding document of a body that governed the affairs of 17 species was a paragraph that still meant something, if you were willing to mean it. Because 47 decisions that had been wrong did not make the 48th inevitable. Because a species that had spent 1,000 years learning that the weak deserved to stand had sent her to this room, and she was not going to let them down. The stars moved slowly past the porthole. Elena Vasquez, ambassador, sat in the quiet and felt the weight of what she carried, and found that she could carry it. That was enough. That would always be enough.